Colorado Territory, 1873. The Rocky Mountains stood as silent witnesses to the harshness of frontier life, where most men measured success by acres claimed and cattle counted. Matthew Grant was no different. At 25, he'd already spent 7 years driving herds, sleeping under stars cold enough to burn, and keeping his distance from anything resembling attachment. The frontier had taught him early. Love was a luxury that got men killed. Sentiment made you hesitate when you needed to draw fast. No point getting close to folks out here, Matthew often told himself as he rode the endless miles between towns. Frontier's a place for surviving, not living. It was the mantra that kept him moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough for roots to take hold. Matthew rode into Silver Creek with nothing but 2 months' wages, a reliable Appaloosa named Scout, and a reputation as a dependable cowhand who asked few questions and kept to himself. The town had sprung up around a modest silver strike, enough to build wooden storefronts and attract hopeful souls, not enough to bring the worst elements of boom towns. He needed work, supplies, and perhaps a hot meal before moving northward toward Wyoming Territory. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as Matthew dismounted outside the general store. His tall frame carried the lean muscle of a man who spent more hours in the saddle than on foot. His face, though weathered by sun and wind, retained a youthfulness that belied the caution in his hazel eyes. A few days' worth of light brown stubble covered his jaw, and dust from the trail clung to his faded blue shirt and worn denim pants. Inside the store, an elderly shopkeeper looked up from his ledger. "Help you, young man." "Just passing through, need some coffee, beans, and ammunition." Matthew kept his voice even, polite but distant, the tone of a man accustomed to brief interactions. "Got all that," the shopkeeper nodded. "Passing through to where?" Matthew hesitated. "Wherever there's honest work for a season." The bell above the door jingled, and Matthew turned out of habit. In frontier towns, it paid to know who entered a room. The woman who stepped inside carried herself with quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the rough-hewn settlement. 21, perhaps 22 years old, with honey-blonde hair pulled back in a practical braid that caught the late afternoon sunlight. Her blue calico dress was simple but well-maintained, and she carried a basket over one arm. "Afternoon, Miss Zara," the shopkeeper's tone warmed considerably. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hollister," she replied, her voice musical but reserved. "I have those books you lent me." She placed 2 worn volumes on the counter, then noticed Matthew. "Pardon me," she said with a slight nod. Matthew touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned back to his supplies. Something about her struck him as different from other frontier women he'd encountered. There was an education in her speech, a thoughtfulness in her eyes that spoke of a life beyond the territory's harsh demands. "Miss Zara Mitchell runs the schoolhouse," the shopkeeper offered, misreading Matthew's curiosity as confusion. "Does the teaching all on her own since her father passed last winter?" Matthew hadn't asked and didn't intend to learn more. People with stories were people who complicated life, and complications got a man killed out west. He gathered his supplies and paid. "Town's hiring a man to clear brush along the North Creek," the shopkeeper mentioned as Matthew turned to leave. "Trying to reduce fire risk before summer, pays fair." Matthew paused. His funds were low enough that a week's work sounded appealing. "Who's doing the hiring?" "Town council, Mayor Porter handles it. He'll be at the Silver Creek Saloon tonight." As Matthew stepped back onto the weathered boardwalk, a commotion erupted down the street. 3 riders galloped through town, whooping and firing pistols into the air. Their horses narrowly missed a wagon, sending a woman and child scrambling for safety. Without thinking, Matthew stepped into the street, positioning himself between the oncoming riders and the schoolteacher, who had just exited the store. The lead rider, a red-faced man with a wild beard, pulled his horse to a halt inches from Matthew. "Got a problem, Cowboy," the man sneered, alcohol heavy on his breath. "Town's not a racetrack," Matthew replied evenly, his hand resting near his holster. "Folks walking about." The rider's companions flanked him, their expressions darkening. For a tense moment, Matthew calculated his odds against 3 drunken men. Then a voice of authority cut through the tension. "That's enough, Silas." A silver-haired man in a black vest approached from the saloon. "You and your boys can drink in my establishment when you can behave like men, not rabid coyotes." The riders grumbled but turned their horses toward the livery. As they departed, the silver-haired man extended his hand to Matthew. "Porter, mayor of this modest settlement. That was either very brave or very foolish, son." Matthew shook his hand briefly. "Just seemed unnecessary." "Well, we appreciate unnecessary decency around here." The mayor glanced at Miss Mitchell, who stood watching the exchange. "You all right, Zara?" "I'm fine, Mayor Porter." Her blue eyes met Matthew's for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Grant." "Matthew Grant." He shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "Just passing through." "Perhaps not so quickly," Mayor Porter interjected. "We could use a man with your instincts for the creek clearing project. Week's work, fair pay." Matthew weighed the offer against the prospect of another immediate journey. "I'll consider it." As Mayor Porter outlined the job, Matthew found his attention drawn to Zara Mitchell, who was now walking toward the schoolhouse at the edge of town. There was something in the set of her shoulders, a determination mixed with what might have been loneliness, that felt uncomfortably familiar. That night in the modest boarding house, Matthew agreed to take the creek-clearing job, 1 week. Then he would move on, as always. The frontier was no place for standing still. The abandoned homestead sat half a mile beyond the creek, where Matthew had been clearing brush for 3 days. Its weathered logs and sagging roof spoke of hopes abandoned, dreams surrendered to the harsh realities of frontier life. Matthew might have ignored it entirely if not for the approaching storm that threatened to drench him before he could return to town. As thunder rolled across the valley, Matthew led Scout to the broken-down structure. "Just until it passes," he told himself, tying the horse beneath the partial shelter of a collapsed lean-to. The cabin's door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking as Matthew pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the gray light filtering through a broken window. The interior was spare, a rusted stove, a table on its side, and little else remained after scavengers had picked it clean. Matthew was about to retreat to the driest corner when his boot caught on a loose floorboard near the hearth. Curious, he knelt and pulled the board free, revealing a small space beneath. Inside lay a metal box about the size of a small Bible, its surface spotted with rust. The lock had long since corroded, and it opened with a reluctant groan. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. The image showed a young couple, the man standing proud in what appeared to be a Union Army uniform, the woman seated beside him in a simple dress, her expression serious but her eyes bright. Matthew turned the photograph over and read the faded inscription. "Edward and Mary Thornton, April 12, 1862. Love endures all." The first raindrops hammered against the roof as Matthew opened the journal. The handwriting was elegant, clearly a woman's hand. The first entry was dated June 1862. "Edward has gone to fight. He says it is his duty, though my heart breaks to see him leave our little farm in Ohio. He promises to return to me, and I must believe it so. When this terrible war ends, we will build our new life in the West as we have dreamed. Until then, I will keep this record of my days, so he may know them when he returns." Matthew found himself sinking to the floor, turning pages as the storm raged outside. The journal chronicled Mary's wait through the long years of the Civil War, her joy at Edward's survival, and their journey west in 1866. Her entries captured both the beauty and brutality of frontier life, the majesty of mountain vistas alongside the backbreaking work of building a homestead. The later entries grew concerning, Edward struggling with what would now be recognized as the lingering trauma of war, Mary's determination to make their dream succeed despite increasing hardship, her patience in the face of his nightmares and dark moods, their mutual grief over a stillborn child buried beneath an aspen grove behind the cabin. As daylight faded and the storm continued, Matthew lit a small fire in the still functional hearth and read on, transfixed by the unfolding story of 2 people who had stood on this same floor, dreamed beneath this same roof. The final entries were from 1870. Edward sleeps peacefully for the first time in months. The winter has been cruel, but spring brings new hope. I planted wildflower seeds around little Sarah's grave yesterday. Edward spoke of building a proper fence for the garden, small steps toward healing. Love endures, even here, even now. 2 weeks later, the fever came so suddenly. 3 days of fighting, and now I am alone. I buried him beside our daughter. The neighbors from 2 miles east helped dig the grave, but they have their own hardships. I cannot stay, though leaving breaks what remains of my heart. Tomorrow I will take what I can carry and walk to Silver Creek, perhaps from there to Denver, where my cousin lives. The dream we shared dies with this place, but I will carry Edward in my heart always. Matthew closed the journal as the last light faded from the sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound stillness. He sat motionless, struck by the echoes of lives once lived with such hope and such pain within these walls. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitary existence pressing down upon him. He had convinced himself that attachment was weakness, that love on the frontier was a fool's gamble. Yet Mary Thornton's words haunted him. Love endures, even here, even now. What had become of her? Had she made it to Denver? Found some measure of happiness after such loss? The questions followed Matthew back to town as dusk settled over the valley. The next evening, Matthew found himself at the schoolhouse door, journal and photograph in hand. He had considered simply giving them to the mayor, but found himself drawn to Zara Mitchell instead. Something in her manner suggested she might understand the significance of what he'd found. She answered his knock with surprise, a book in one hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear. "Mr. Grant, is everything all right?" "Miss Mitchell," Matthew removed his hat. "I apologize for disturbing you. I found something that might be of interest, perhaps historically, to the town." Curiosity replaced her initial caution. "Please come in." The schoolhouse was a single room, neat and organized despite limited resources. A small living area had been partitioned at the back, suggesting she made her home here as well. Matthew explained about finding the journal and handed it to her along with the photograph. "I thought perhaps you might know if this Mary Thornton ever made it to town, or what became of her." Zara carefully opened the journal, her expression softening as she studied the photograph. "This is remarkable, Mr. Grant." She gestured to 2 chairs near her desk. "Please sit. Would you care for tea while I look through this?" Matthew had intended to leave the items and go, but found himself accepting. For the next hour, he watched as Zara read passages from the journal, occasionally reading aloud sections that particularly moved her. Her eyes shone with empathy for the long-gone couple. "The Thornton homestead," she said eventually. "I've heard of it. My father kept records of all the original settlers." She crossed to a small bookshelf and retrieved a leather ledger. Here Edward Thornton filed a claim in 1866, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Her finger traced the entry. "And look, there's a notation from 1870. Claim abandoned after death of claimant. Widow departed for Denver." "So she made it that far at least," Matthew said, "but nothing about her afterward." Zara looked thoughtful. "What makes this particularly interesting to me is that my mother came from Denver around that time. She never spoke much about her life before meeting my father." She hesitated. "There's a trunk of her things I've never fully sorted through. Perhaps there might be some connection, though it's unlikely." Matthew found himself unexpectedly invested. "Would you mind looking?" The trunk, when brought out, contained the typical keepsakes of a woman's life. Dried flowers pressed between Bible pages, letters tied with faded ribbon, a child's drawing. As Zara carefully examined each item, Matthew felt increasingly awkward about his intrusion into such personal matters. "I should go," he said, rising. "I've taken enough of your evening." "Wait," Zara said suddenly, holding up a faded tintype photograph. "Look at this." The image showed 3 women standing together outside what appeared to be a Denver shop front. One was clearly a younger version of Zara's mother. Beside her stood a woman who, despite the poor quality of the image, bore a striking resemblance to Mary Thornton. "It could be her," Zara whispered. "And this woman." She pointed to the third figure, an elegant lady in her 40s. "This is my great-aunt Catherine. She owned a millinery shop in Denver. My mother lived with her before coming to Colorado Territory." Matthew leaned closer, studying the image. "Is there anything written on it?" Zara turned it over. In faded ink was written, "Catherine, Eliza and Mary, Denver, 1871. "Mary," Matthew repeated. "It could be a coincidence." Perhaps Zara was already reaching deeper into the trunk. "But my mother kept everything for a reason." Her hand emerged with a small packet of letters tied with black ribbon. "These are addressed to my mother from someone named M. Blackburn." As they carefully unfolded the brittle papers, a story emerged through fragments. Mary Thornton had indeed made it to Denver, where she found work in Zara Mitchell's shop alongside Zara's mother, Eliza. Within a year, she had married a kind widower named James Blackburn and moved with him to Kansas. The letters spanned several years, chronicling a friendship maintained across distance. The final letter, dated 1878, announced the birth of Mary's son, named Edward after her first husband. "Though life has granted me a second chance at happiness," she wrote, "I keep the memory of my first love and our little Sarah in a special chamber of my heart. James understands this and honors it." Perhaps that is true love's nature, not to demand exclusivity of memory, but to offer healing for old wounds while creating new joy. Matthew sat in silence as Zara finished reading. The simple eloquence of Mary's words penetrated the armor he had built around himself over years of deliberate isolation. "It's remarkable," Zara said softly, "how love persisted despite everything she endured." She looked up at Matthew. "Thank you for bringing this to me. It's like finding a missing piece of my family's story." Matthew nodded, unexpectedly moved. "I'm glad it found its way to you." As he rose to leave, Zara hesitated. "Mr. Grant." "The town is hosting a social on Saturday evening. A simple gathering with music and food to celebrate the creek clearing project's completion. Would you consider attending before you move on?" Something in her eyes, a blend of hope and understanding, made refusal difficult. "Perhaps I will," he said, surprising himself with the answer. Outside in the cool evening air, Matthew walked slowly back to the boarding house. Mary Thornton's journey from devastating loss to renewed hope lingered in his thoughts. For the first time in years, he questioned whether his belief in emotional isolation as survival was wisdom or merely fear disguised as frontier pragmatism. The social gathering was held in the open area beside the church, with lanterns strung between posts creating pools of golden light against the deepening blue of evening. Tables laden with food lined one side, while a small group of musicians played fiddle and guitar beneath a canvas awning. Matthew arrived late, having nearly talked himself out of attending altogether. He stood at the edge of the gathering, watching families and neighbors interact with the easy familiarity of shared history. Children darted between adults, laughing and playing impromptu games of tag. Older couples swayed to the music while young men and women engaged in the careful dance of courtship around the periphery. "You came," Zara's voice startled him from his observations. She wore a dress of pale blue that complemented her eyes, her blonde hair arranged in a more elaborate style than her usual practical braid. "Seemed impolite to refuse," he replied, then realizing how ungracious that sounded, added, "It's a fine gathering. Silver Creek may be small, but we make the most of our occasions for joy." She offered him a plate of food. "Have you eaten?" The evening unfolded with unexpected ease. Matthew found himself drawn into conversation with Mayor Porter and other townspeople, answering questions about cattle drives and territories he'd traveled. When Zara mentioned the journal he'd found, several older residents shared stories of the early settlement days, painting a picture of community formed through mutual hardship and support. "Terrible thing losing the Thorntons," one elderly woman remarked. "Such a handsome couple. That war broke something in Edward that never quite mended." "But Mary made it," Matthew found himself saying. "She found a new life in Kansas, according to the letters Miss Mitchell discovered." The conversation turned to other topics, but Matthew remained struck by the revelation's impact on him. Mary Thornton had survived devastation not by isolating herself, but by allowing new connections, new love to enter her life. As the music shifted to a waltz, Zara appeared at his side again. "Do you dance, mister?" "Grant." Matthew hesitated, "Not in many years." Her smile held gentle challenge. "Perhaps it's like writing, the body remembers." To his own surprise, Matthew found himself escorting her to the area cleared for dancing. His movements were stiff at first, but Zara's patient guidance and the rhythm of the music gradually eased his tension. As they circled among other couples, her hand light in his, Matthew felt something long dormant stirring within him, a recognition that human connection offered not just vulnerability, but also something essential he had denied himself for too long. "You mentioned moving on after the Creek project," Zara said as the music continued. "Is there somewhere particular you're headed?" Matthew had no ready answer. For years, his only direction had been away, from attachments, from complications, from the possibility of loss. No destination in mind, just the habit of movement. "Movement can become its own kind of prison," she observed quietly. The insight, so gentle yet so penetrating, left him momentarily speechless. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the gathering. The drunken riders from days earlier had returned, this time with more companions. Their leader, Silas, swaggered toward the musicians. "Well, ain't this sweet," he slurred. "Whole town playing make-believe that this mud hole is civilized." Mayor Porter stepped forward. "You boys turn around and head back to wherever you've been drinking. This is a peaceful gathering." Silas laughed an ugly sound. "Peaceful in Indian territory, with winter coming and half your crops failed," he gestured broadly. "You folks are one bad season from starving, playing your fiddles while Rome burns." His companions spread out, their hands resting near holstered weapons. Women drew children closer. Men moved subtly to place themselves between their families and the intruders. Matthew guided Zara toward the edge of the gathering, his instincts sharpening. "Who are they?" he asked quietly. "Silas Rook and his gang," she whispered. "They have a camp in the hills, troublemakers mostly, but dangerous when drunk." Silas spotted them and his bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Well, if it ain't the prissy schoolmarm and her new pet Cowboy." He staggered forward. "Still playing hard to get, Miss Mitchell. You turned down my proposal awful quick for someone with such limited prospects." "Step back, Rook," Matthew said, his voice level but firm. "Or what, Drifter?" Silas sneered. "You aim to put down roots and protect these fine folks. Men like you don't stay. Men like you understand that the frontier ain't for the weak." He lurched closer. "Tell her, Cowboy. Tell her how quick you'll be moving on when the first snow flies." Something in his taunting struck too close to Matthew's own beliefs, and for a moment doubt flickered across his face. Silas saw it and grinned triumphantly. "See there, Miss Mitchell, he knows I speak truth." Mayor Porter and several other men had moved to flank Rook's companions, creating a standoff. The celebration had transformed into a tableau of frontier tension, civilization and chaos balanced on a knife's edge. Zara stepped forward, her voice clear in the sudden silence. "Mr. Rook, you're not welcome here, not because we fear you, but because we choose what kind of community we're building. If hardship comes, we'll face it together as we always have. That's not weakness, it's the only real strength there is." Her words hung in the air, simple but powerful. Matthew saw several townspeople straighten, drawing confidence from her calm defiance. Silas's face darkened. His hand twitched toward his gun, but Matthew moved faster, placing himself directly between Rook and Zara. "I wouldn't," Matthew said quietly. "Not here. Not tonight." For a tense moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then the sheriff emerged from the crowd, rifle in hand. "Time to leave, Silas. You and your boys can sleep it off in my cells, or you can ride out peacefully. Those are your only options." Outnumbered and facing determined resistance, Silas finally backed down. "This ain't finished," he muttered, but allowed himself to be escorted away by his more sober companions. As tension eased from the gathering, Matthew turned to find Zara watching him with an unreadable expression. "I should walk you home," he said, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on them. They moved in silence through the darkened streets, the sounds of the social gradually fading behind them. When they reached the schoolhouse, Zara lit a lamp and turned to face him. "You positioned yourself between me and danger twice now," she said. "Yet you maintain that attachment is something to be avoided." Matthew looked away, instinct nothing more. "I don't believe that." She moved closer. "The man who was moved by Mary Thornton's story, who danced tonight, who stands ready to protect people he barely knows, that man understands connection better than he admits." "Understanding something doesn't make it wise," Matthew countered. "The frontier breaks more than it builds." "Only if we let it." Zara's gaze was steady. "Mary Thornton lost everything, yet found the courage to build anew. Is your fear stronger than her courage, Matthew?" The question struck him like physical blow. Before he could formulate a response, Zara continued. "I've known loss too. My father died last winter, my mother 5 years before that. I could have returned east to distant relatives, but this community is my home. These people, for all their flaws and struggles, are my family now." She gestured to the schoolhouse. "This work matters. Helping children see beyond the harshness of frontier life matters." "It's different for you," Matthew argued. "You have purpose here." "Purpose isn't something we find, Matthew. It's something we create." She stepped closer. "I've watched you this week with the work crew, at the social. You fit here more naturally than you realize." The lamp's golden light softened her features, illuminating the hope and challenge in her eyes. Matthew found himself drawn toward her with a force both frightening and exhilarating. When she reached up to touch his cheek, he didn't pull away. "I leave tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion he'd suppressed for too long. "Perhaps," her smile held sadness but not defeat, "but tonight you're still here." Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative with the weight of different fears, his of connection, hers of abandonment. But as Matthew's arms encircled her, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of possibility rather than conclusion. Later, walking back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Matthew carried the warmth of that kiss like a coal burning through the ice he'd built around his heart. Tomorrow, he would leave as planned. The frontier was no place for sentiment. Yet for the first time, the thought of riding away brought no comfort, only a hollow ache he couldn't ignore. Dawn broke clear and cold over Silver Creek. Matthew saddled Scout with methodical precision, his few possessions packed and secured. The town was quiet, most residents still sleeping after the previous evening's celebration. He should have felt the familiar anticipation of open trails and new horizons. Instead, each preparation felt mechanical, divorced from purpose. Mary Thornton's words from the journal echoed in his thoughts. "Love endures, even here, even now." Matthew led Scout toward the edge of town, past the general store where Hollister was just opening his doors. The shopkeeper nodded in understanding. He'd seen many drifters come and go. At the town's edge, Matthew paused, looking back at the collection of buildings that formed Silver Creek. The schoolhouse sat at the far end, smoke already rising from its chimney. Zara would be preparing for the day's lessons, perhaps thinking of him, perhaps already accepting his departure as inevitable. The road stretched before him, leading north toward Wyoming territory and the ranches where winter work might be found. Matthew swung into the saddle, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. "Let's go, Scout," he murmured, but made no move to urge the horse forward. A rider approached from the south, a young man on a lathered horse, riding hard. He slowed only slightly as he passed Matthew. "Rook's gang hit the Peterson place," the rider called out, "fired the barn and stole stock. They're headed for the schoolhouse," said they're settling scores. Cold dread replaced Matthew's indecision. He wheeled Scout around and galloped back toward town, where the news was already spreading. Men emerged from homes and businesses, grabbing rifles and forming a hasty defense force under Sheriff Kendrick's direction. "How many?" the sheriff demanded of the messenger. 8, maybe 10, the young man gasped. Silas was raving about teaching the town a lesson, said the schoolmarm needed to learn her place. Matthew didn't wait for more. He spurred Scout toward the schoolhouse, outpacing the gathering posse. Fear drove him not for himself but for Zara. The familiar isolation he had cultivated for years was shattered by the overwhelming need to ensure her safety. He spotted the riders a quarter-mile before the schoolhouse, Silas and 7 others, advancing at a deliberate pace, some carrying torches despite the morning light. Their intention was clear. Destruction born of wounded pride and frontier lawlessness. Matthew cut cross-country, reaching the schoolhouse minutes before Rook's gang. Zara stood on the porch, a rifle in her hands, having heard the approaching danger. "Get inside," Matthew ordered as he dismounted. "Barricade the door." "I won't hide," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "This isn't the time for bravery," he insisted. "Nor for standing alone." She stepped beside him, rifle ready. "The children will be arriving soon, we have to hold them off." The first riders appeared around the bend. Silas spotted them and let out a whoop of malicious delight. "Look here, boys, the drifter decided to die for the schoolmarm after all." Matthew leveled his Winchester. "That's far enough, Rook." "Or what?" Silas laughed. "You can't shoot us all before we burn that schoolhouse to the ground." "He doesn't have to." Sheriff Kendrick's voice rang out as he and a dozen armed townsmen appeared on the rise behind the schoolhouse. "Drop your weapons, you're surrounded." Silas hesitated, his drunken bravado faltering as he assessed the odds, but alcohol and rage clouded his judgment. With a roar of defiance, he spurred his horse forward, firing wildly. The next moments passed in a blur of gunfire and chaos. Matthew pushed Zara toward the schoolhouse steps, firing at Rook's oncoming horse. The animal reared, throwing its rider to the ground. The other gang members scattered, some retreating, others firing from horseback. A bullet splintered wood near Matthew's head. He returned fire, catching one rider in the shoulder. The sheriff and townsmen added their firepower, creating a withering defense. Silas regained his feet and charged the porch, desperation making him reckless. Matthew met him halfway, their collision sending both men rolling in the dirt. Silas was bigger, fueled by rage and whiskey, but Matthew fought with the cold precision of a man who had finally found something worth protecting. A vicious blow caught Matthew's temple, dazing him. Silas scrambled for his fallen knife, rising to deliver what would have been a killing strike, when a rifle shot cracked through the morning air. Silas staggered, a look of disbelief crossing his face before he collapsed. Zara stood on the porch, rifle still raised, her expression a mixture of determination and shock at what she'd been forced to do. The fight drained from the remaining gang members. Within minutes, the sheriff had them disarmed and bound. 2 were wounded, 1 critically. Silas lay motionless, his reign of terror ended by the very woman he had sought to intimidate. Matthew rose shakily, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. He crossed to Zara, gently taking the rifle from her trembling hands. "You stayed," she whispered, the simple observation containing a world of meaning. "I couldn't leave," he replied, the truth of it resonating through him. "Not with you in danger." "And now?" Her eyes searched his, looking past the blood and dirt to the decision forming in his soul. Before he could answer, Mayor Porter approached, his expression grave but grateful. "Miss Mitchell, Mr. Grant. The town owes you both a debt that cannot be repaid." He surveyed the aftermath of the brief, violent confrontation. Rook's been a shadow over Silver Creek for too long. His kind believes the frontier exists for men to take what they want through force. Matthew helped Zara sit on the porch steps as the adrenaline of battle faded. The sheriff organized men to remove the dead and wounded, while others went to warn arriving schoolchildren to return home for the day. "I need to clean that cut," Zara said, touching Matthew's temple gently. Inside the schoolhouse, as she bathed the wound with water and whiskey, Matthew found himself studying her face, the determined set of her jaw, the compassion in her eyes despite the trauma she had just endured. This was not a woman who hid from frontier hardship. This was a woman who faced it with quiet courage day after day. "I was leaving," he said finally. "I know." She applied a clean bandage to his temple. "But I was already turning back when I heard about Rook." Matthew caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "I couldn't ride away, not from you, not from whatever this is becoming." Zara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "And now?" Now I'm thinking Mary Thornton had the right of it. He stood, drawing her up with him. She lost everything but found the courage to build again, to love again. He took a deep breath. I've been running from connection since I was 18, telling myself it was wisdom, that the frontier was no place for sentiment. He shook his head. But I was wrong, Zara. It's precisely because life is harsh here that love matters more, not less. Outside, the town was recovering from the morning's violence. Lives had been risked and taken. The fragile peace of Silver Creek had been tested. Yet as Matthew looked out the schoolhouse window, he saw not just the aftermath of conflict, but the resilience of community, neighbors checking on one another, women bringing food to those who had fought, children being comforted by adults who had risked their lives to protect them. I can't promise it will be easy, he said, turning back to Zara. I've spent years drifting. Learning to stay will take time. All worthwhile things do. She stepped closer, her hand finding his. But if Mary Thornton could begin again after such loss, perhaps we can build something from a beginning instead. In that moment, Matthew understood what he had been missing in his years of solitary wandering. The frontier's harshness was real, but it was only half the truth. The other half lived in moments of connection, in barn raisings and town socials, in shared grief and communal celebration, in the courage to remain open despite the risk of loss. I'd like to stay, he said simply, if there's a place for me here. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. There is now. Spring 1874. Silver Creek bloomed with new life as winter's grip finally released the valley. Matthew Grant stood on the porch of the newly constructed house at the edge of town, watching riders approach along the main road. 5 months had transformed his life in ways he once would have thought impossible. The town council, grateful for his role in ending Silas Rook's threat, had offered him the position of deputy sheriff. The work suited him. His years of drifting had given him insights into the types of trouble that could find frontier settlements, and his natural caution served well in keeping peace. More importantly, those months had cemented what began the day he found Mary Thornton's journal, a profound shift in how he understood love and connection on the frontier. The approaching riders were familiar, Mayor Porter and 3 town councilmen returning from the territorial capital. Their mission had been to secure additional funding for the school and to register Silver Creek's official boundaries for the territorial census. Matthew stepped off the porch to greet them, noting the satisfied expressions on their dust-covered faces. Successful trip, gentlemen. Mayor Porter dismounted with a grin. Indeed, the school funds are approved and Silver Creek is officially recognized with its full township boundaries. He handed Matthew a leather portfolio. And these land title papers are officially registered as well. Congratulations, property owner. The 40 acres Matthew had purchased, land that included the abandoned Thornton homestead, was now legally his. The cabin had been beyond repair, but its logs had been salvaged to build a new home closer to town, a home with a future. Zara will be pleased to hear about the school funding, Matthew said, accepting the portfolio. Where is your intended this fine afternoon? Porter asked. At the schoolhouse, preparing for tomorrow's examinations. Matthew couldn't help the smile that formed whenever he spoke of her. Their courtship had progressed with a certainty that surprised the town almost as much as it surprised Matthew himself. As the men continued toward town, Matthew returned to his work in the small garden beside the house. The simple act of planting, of committing seeds to soil with the expectation of remaining to see their growth, still felt novel after so many years of transience. Later, as afternoon light mellowed toward evening, he heard the sound of an approaching buggy. Zara appeared around the bend, guiding the horse with confident hands. Her blonde hair caught the golden light, and her blue calico dress was the same one she had worn the day they first met in the general store. Matthew set aside his tools and walked to meet her, lifting her down from the buggy with hands that no longer hesitated to touch, to hold, to connect. The garden looks wonderful, she observed, surveying his day's work, though I think you've planted enough potatoes to feed half the territory. Better too many than too few, he replied, enjoying the easy familiarity they had developed. Mayor Porter returned with good news about the school funding. Her face brightened. "Wonderful, we can finally replace those awful old readers and get proper maps." She linked her arm through his as they walked toward the house. "Any word on our other matter?" Matthew patted the portfolio. "All official. The land is registered in both our names as we'll be married before the first harvest." She squeezed his arm, her happiness evident in the gesture. Their wedding was planned for early summer, a fact that still amazed Matthew when he allowed himself to reflect on how completely his life had changed. Inside the modest house, evidence of their coming union was everywhere. Books from her collection shared space with his practical tools. Curtains she had sewn hung beside the rifle rack he had built, their future taking physical shape in the blending of two lives. On the mantel above the fireplace sat Mary Thornton's journal and photograph in their places of honor. Matthew had built a wooden case with a glass front to protect them from dust and damage. Alongside them stood the photograph of Zara's mother with Mary and Catherine in Denver, connecting their personal histories to the frontier story they were now continuing. As evening settled over Silver Creek, Matthew and Zara sat on their porch, watching the distant mountains turn purple against the fading sky. Her head rested against his shoulder, her hand entwined with his. "I had a letter from Denver today," she said. "My mother's cousin has located Mary Thornton Blackburn's son in Kansas. He was quite moved to learn about the journal and his parents' homestead." "Will he want the journal returned?" Matthew asked. "He said it belongs with those who found meaning in his mother's words." Zara looked up at him. "He asked only for copies of certain passages, which I'll send next week." Matthew nodded, grateful. The journal had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder that love on the frontier was not just possible but essential. Mary Thornton's journey from devastating loss to renewed hope had illuminated his own path from isolation to connection. "Sometimes I wonder if we would have found each other without Mary's story," Zara mused. Matthew considered this. "I believe we would have, but I might not have had the courage to recognize what I was feeling, to stay instead of riding on." The truth of this settled between them comfortably. The frontier remained a place of hardship and uncertainty, but Matthew no longer saw these as reasons to avoid attachment. Rather, they were precisely why connection mattered, why building a life with someone of shared courage made more sense than facing wilderness alone. As twilight deepened into night, lights appeared in the windows of Silver Creek. Each represented a family, a story, a commitment to building something that outlasted individual struggle. Matthew Grant, once determined to remain detached from such commitments, now found himself grateful to be part of that constellation of frontier hope. "What are you thinking?" Zara asked, noticing his contemplative silence. Matthew drew her closer, his arm secure around her shoulders. "That Mary Thornton was right. Love endures even here, even now." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Especially here. Especially now." In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, a reminder of wilderness never fully tamed. But on their porch in the home they were building together, Matthew and Zara held fast to the truth they had discovered. That the frontier's greatest challenge was not survival alone, but creating a life worth the struggle. A life enriched by the very connections Matthew had once feared, now embraced as his greatest strength. The forgotten love story had changed not just his understanding, but his future, transforming a drifter into a man with roots as deep and promising as the seeds taking hold in the garden of the home they now shared.